Don't get me now, y'all. Stop. The devil made me say that.
He's passed on now. That was Flip Wilson imitation. We have about 100 here. Some of you folks are still sleeping. What is that all about? You didn't stay up and party all night. Some of you people forgot what the word was about. And sitting there like, well, he said something funny, but darn, I didn't get it. Okay, our next presenter, our next speaker is Bill Conklin. And as you've seen on the program, let me just give you a little background on Bill. He is a self-taught legal researcher and strategist, which, as a person who went through law school myself, I say that he's got a real commitment to be able to do that kind of thing. Because even in law school, I hated that. Who hollering? Is it something I said? Hello? I've been heckled before, but boy, this is interesting. Okay. He's a native of Colorado. He holds a master's degree in communications from the University of Colorado. For the past 20 years, Bill has taught himself how to defend his rights when the Internal Revenue Service, it's really slavery, acts against him. And he has 6 published federal appeals court wins. That's like victories, like the Lakers be doing now, 10 in a row. They got Glenn Rice, he be shooting like this, and they got big old... Anyway, that's a whole different topic. Lakers might do it all now, but anyway, let me get back to the point, talk about what Bill Conklin is doing. 6 published federal appeal court wins as a pro se litigant. And Bill hopes that this book that he is selling here today will encourage others such as yourself who have bothered to come here this morning to do the same thing that he has done. Let me just insert something there too. It takes courage to do the kinds of things he's done. I've said many a time in my 20 years as an active libertarian, I know it takes courage to be a libertarian when you're a black guy. It takes courage to be a libertarian when you ain't a black guy, ladies and gentlemen. Because most of you folks want to take only one half of the equation. Say, yeah, I agree with that economic slide, but those people and that, I just... No. Consistency. Bill has put himself on the line, that kind of courage. And I have the honor of presenting to you for the next 50 minutes, Mr. Bill Conklin. Thank you.
Well, we'll see if the microphone... Can everybody hear me okay? Usually these mics aren't tall enough for me. How's that? That better? I'm sorry? What's the difference... Excuse me. What's the difference between baseball and the IRS? Anybody know? In baseball, if you're caught stealing, you're out. What's the difference between a revenue officer and a leech? A leech will let go and drop off when its victim dies. What's the difference between IRS agents and vultures? Vultures don't get frequent flyer discounts. An IRS agent and a murderer jump off the Empire State Building at the same time. Who hits the ground first? Who cares? After years of hard work, a guy named Joe took his first vacation on a luxury cruise ship. In a deck chair, he recognized a former high school classmate, a long-lost friend from his old hometown. He crossed the deck, seized the fellow's hand, and said, "Hello, Pete, I haven't seen you in years. What are you doing these days?" "I'm an IRS agent," whispered Pete. "But don't tell my mother, she still thinks I'm a pimp." Now look around. If there's anybody that's not laughing, he might be from the IRS. I've got to say that I've been doing this for 25 years, And this is the first convention I've ever come to when we had IRS agents that admitted they used to work for the IRS. This is great. It's fantastic. So let's give another hand here to Shelley for what she did. In 1976, by the way, while I'm talking here, I'm having flyers and business cards passed out to you so that if you want to get a hold of me after this, you'll know how to do that. In 1976, it was the 200-year anniversary of our Declaration of Independence. And I was walking around the block getting a little exercise after a hard day of being an elementary school teacher, and I came upon a little building that said, National Tax Strike. I go, what's this all about? And I went in, and there were some old guys about the age I am now that were talking about some really crazy things. And I listened, and I thought this sounded pretty loony, but I listened some more. And being sort of an inquisitive guy, I went to the law library, and I started researching some of the things they were saying. And lo and behold, as I started reading cases, I found out that some of this stuff did make some sense. So I wrote an article, and I sent it to various Denver newspapers, and one Denver newspaper published it. 3 days after it was published, I received a TCMP audit, which is Taxpayer Compliance Measurement Program audit. It's the nastiest kind of audit you can get. They want to know everything. They want to know like how many rolls of toilet paper you use a year. They want to, I mean, you name it, these guys want to know it. I couldn't believe it. But the first thing I realized was that I was being harassed for exercising my First Amendment right. I knew that much. I knew that I had a right to say something about a government agency, but what were they going to do? They were going to pound me into the ground for that. So what I did, I was very scared actually when I got these because, I mean, I had no idea this was going to happen to me. But that day, what happened to me is that in my mind, I declared war against the Internal Revenue Service. And that is why I stand here today, and my entire life changed that morning. What happened is, I was so scared I went to an attorney, and he wanted $2,000 to help me comply with the audit. Now this is in 1976, when a teacher with a master's degree made $12,000 a year, and probably gave 4 of it to the IRS. He wanted another $2,000 so that I could tell the IRS, fine, you guys, take my other $6,000. Well, I was quite upset. I just didn't know exactly what to do. So the very first thing I did is I just started reading books, and I filed a lawsuit for injunctive relief against the IRS. And one of the things they'd done to me is I was a pastor in a church, and they wanted to get the church records. Now, I can't tell you the whole story of my litigation here because I only have an hour, and that would take about 4 hours. But I got a lot of wins against them, and in that particular piece of litigation, the lower court judge threw me out because of the Anti-Injunction Act. And that's an act that says you can't sue the government. But the Court of Appeals gave me some amazing encouragement. The Court of Appeals, when I appealed it, said, that's right. Conklin cannot sue the government on this issue because of the Anti-Injunction Act, but Conklin doesn't have to sue the government on this issue because they can't do what they're doing anyway. So the Court of Appeals gave me an injunction, and what the IRS had done is they'd said that they would pull the tax-exempt status of my church if I didn't comply with the summons. Well, after that, there was a whole long history of litigation. Within a couple of years, I'd quit teaching and started doing this full-time. I've done it full-time ever since, except for a couple of years when I had to work at a few other things when the IRS pounded on me really hard in the middle 80s when they were killing all the tax protest groups. But I managed to pull myself up again, and now I would say I'm having more influence than ever because I've even talked a few IRS agents into coming to our side, which you will find out this weekend. I only have 999,000 to go. Well, I guess one of my biggest fears is that we might get rid of the IRS before I'm ready to retire. Well, anyway, during my history of litigation, I started to realize that there were some issues that were better than other issues in the freedom movement. And the issue that I decided I really liked was an issue that was pioneered by a guy named A.J. Porth. How many people have heard of A.J. Porth? See, everybody that's heard of A.J. Porth is probably my age or older. But A.J. Porth was a guy who back in this, probably in the 50s and 60s, started raising the Fifth Amendment issue. Later on, a guy named Marvin Cooley and Charles Riley came along. How many people have heard of those two guys? Okay. So you can see me and some of the other people in this group have been around a while. And like Shelley said, unfortunately, we're still having meetings talking about it. We still have not accomplished our goal. However, I decided that the Fifth Amendment issue had never been raised properly because the courts always weaseled out of it. One thing you've got to realize in this game is that you're dealing with a court system and you're dealing with a federal agency that pulls aces out of their pocket and stuffs them in the deck whenever they want. So it's not a fair game. And what you've got to do is figure out how to trick them so that no matter how way they rule, you win. Now, I thought for about 5 years of how I could trick the federal court system on the Fifth Amendment issue. And I finally figured out how to do it after about 8 years, and I filed a lawsuit, and here's what I did. Because I knew they'd figure out a way to weasel out. In my case, they weaseled out of it, but they made themselves look like dopes. And they basically ruled that filing tax returns is not compelled. By the way, there was a case a couple weeks ago that if I have time I'll tell you about that took another interesting position that supports what I'm saying. However, what I did was I said, okay, the IRS has this penalty section, 6702, where they give you a $500 penalty for filing a frivolous return. So I've got to figure out a way to get them to fine me $500 so that I can pay it and sue them and get this into federal court so I don't get the Anti-Injunction Act thrown in my face. So what I did was I filed a tax return, but I wanted it not to be like any previous case law so that they couldn't use that case law against me that was specifically on point. They used it anyway and pretended like it was on point, but you know, that's how they operate. But what happened was I filed a tax return. Everything on it was completely normal, except I didn't sign it. And I attached to it a Form 2848 Power of Attorney form and gave IRS District Counsel power of attorney to sign the form for me if and only if they could do it without waiving my Fifth Amendment rights. And I requested an extension of time for me to file all future returns until they signed that one and showed me how to do it. Now the IRS did what I thought they'd do. They're sort of like a machine. They fined me $500 and told me it was frivolous. I argued with them, and finally I filed a claim for filed a claim for a refund lawsuit in federal court and got it in front of a judge in Denver. So here I am sitting in front of this judge in Denver for a while. We file a motion for summary judgment. I file one, the government files one. That's a motion where you tell the judge that you can settle this on the law and we don't need to do anything else. Just here it is, judge, decide. So the judge called us in and we had a hearing. The judge called me up there and he said, Mr. Conklin, there's something I have to tell you that's fatal to your case. I said, what's that, Judge? He said, Mr. Conklin, he said, you're asking me to overturn the federal tax system, and that's not something I'm in a position to do. Well, I guess it was pretty obvious I was asking him to overturn the federal tax system, but you know what? He didn't tell me, Mr. Conklin, what's fatal to your case is that you're full of garbage, or that your legal arguments are crap, or whatever, you know. He didn't say any of that. He said that what's wrong with your argument is you're asking me to overturn the federal tax system, and I can't do that. Well, that's actually what's wrong with federal judges, is that they can't do that, or they won't do that. And that's why we need to change the federal judiciary, which is a whole other issue. But anyway, what was absolutely amazing after that is he sat on the case for another 6 years. I waited for him to decide. And finally, he decided about 6 years later, he ruled against me and he said, Mr. Conklin does not understand the nature of the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment applies only to compelled testimony. I'm serious. He said, I'm out of there because I argued that the Fifth Amendment applies to tax returns and it doesn't apply to tax returns because it only applies to compelled testimony. Amen. Well then, what are tax returns? They're not compelled, and not compelled means voluntary. And of course, then I went through the entire Internal Revenue Manual before I had a computer to do this, And I pulled out every reference to the word voluntary. And you know, the IRS consistently uses that adjective. They don't need to, but they do, because they know they've got a problem. And they've got a Privacy Act notice, and what does that say? It says any information that you put on that tax return can be given to the Department of Justice. And what does the Department of Justice use with that information? They use it in criminal tax cases. That's what they do. They do it all the time. Now, you know where the Fifth Amendment came from? Back in Old England, they used to take people and they'd put them on the rack and they'd torture them until they confessed. Okay? And then once they confessed, then they do whatever they wanted to do to them because they were guilty. Well, they came up with the Fifth Amendment so that we didn't have to give the government information that can be used in criminal cases. So now what happens in this country? In this country, every year, over 100 million people make a confession and give it to the government, and the government tells them up front that they can use it in a criminal case anytime they want to. They can give it to any state or any foreign country that they want to, and they can use it in a criminal case, and they make the people sign it under the penalty of perjury, and over 100 million sheep give that to the government every year. Now, why do they do that? Shelley hit it right on the head to get a refund. So they waived their Fifth Amendment rights for a new refrigerator. And, you know, when I first started this, about 99% of the people told me I was nuts. Now it's down. I mean, now it's only about 70%. So we are making some progress. So, what I did then, after the judge ruled against me, is I appealed it to the Circuit Court of Appeals. And I said the lower court was wrong. I appealed and argued that we are required to file tax returns. Took up to the circuit, and I said, the judge is wrong, we are required to file. Now, I got the circuit, and I had a good record with the circuit. I have 6 published wins in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. I'd been rubbing the IRS in the mud for 10 years before this. Circuit Court of Appeals didn't even read my brief. They were so irritated that somebody would raise a tax-type, protester-type issue, they had me out of there in about 25 minutes. And they fined me $6,000 for arguing a frivolous argument of law that we are required to file tax returns. No, I'm serious. This really happened. So I said, well, now what am I going to do? So I filed all kinds of appeals, took it back to the lower court in order to get the judge to... I was supposed to take it back there for him to review it. He told me to shut up. He said I couldn't say anything. There's only 2 things you can say, Mr. Conklin. The first thing you can address is how much the government is paid per hour, and you can address how long they took to write the brief. I said, well, Judge, they claim they took 60 hours at $100 an hour. I said, I guess they're worth $100 an hour. I mean, you know, they went to law school. They're probably worth $100 an hour. But 60 hours to write that brief, Judge? I could have written it in 10. But the judge ruled against me, slapped me with a $6,000 fine. I took it up to the Supreme Court twice. I had an on-point Supreme Court case, the Garner case, where the Garner said that testimony on a tax return is compelled for purposes of the Fifth Amendment. I was arguing an on-point Supreme Court case, and I got fined $6,000 for arguing a frivolous argument. And the Supreme Court wouldn't take it. Now, a lot of times I hear a lot of these tax protester types around the country telling me they're relying on Supreme Court cases. Let me tell you something. You can't rely on a Supreme Court case, and the reason for that is because you're not going to get a chance to go there and let the Supreme Court stand up for what they said, because they're not going to let you in. So the only thing you can rely on is a Court of Appeals case, and then they might change their mind if they don't like you, because that's just the way it works. So you have to be very careful when you fight this system. You've got to figure out a way to have fun with it. And I'm still having fun with this issue, because here's what I did next. I said, okay, so this is an unpublished case, so what will I do? I sent out a news release, and I got people all over the United States to send donations to the first honest judge in the history of America for ruling that the income tax was voluntary. So the judge got thousands of dollars to put in a bank account with many thank you letters from people around the country. And if anybody in here wants to send the judge a $20 contribution with a thank you letter, I'm sure he'd appreciate it, because it would probably take him about $1,000 worth of hassle to deal with that $20. But what the judge had to do was he had to set up I mean, this is a great way to do a rebellion, you know. Pay them and tell them how nice they are. So what happened was the judge got a bunch of fan mail, just mail telling him what a great guy he was for ruling that the income tax is not compelled. And he got a bunch of money. He put it in a special bank account. And then he had to have another hearing to figure out what to do with it. Finally, he gave it to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice then wrote me a letter. And they said, we don't have full payment on this yet. And, you know, I could have gotten full payment by now because I could, you know, just keep pounding and getting people to send money in, and eventually they'd get everything they wanted. But, and I still may do that someday if they put the pressure on. But here's what happened. The Department of Justice sent me a letter, and they said, you owe us X amount of dollars. And I said, wow, that's interesting. I said, I get fined $500 for filing something that the government considers as frivolous, and then you guys fine me another $6,000 to due process. I'm serious. We're in a country where the government can do anything they want to you, fine you $500 because you ask them a question, and then you get fined another $6,000 because you argue about it? That's the country we live in, people. That's what's going on in this country. And you know, probably the only place you could get this many people to a rally is in Southern California, because there's about 11 million people down here. And I'm glad we've got a full room. But you know what? We should have about 10 hotels full today. We should have a lot more people here. And that's what, and that's what we've got to do. So anyway, what I said to the government was, you know, I say, always have fun with what you're doing. I wrote him back a letter and I said, hey, you guys, I got an idea. Here's what you ought to do. I haven't paid you, so your next thing you should do is send me some judgment, credit, or interrogatories. You know, that's what you do when you beat somebody in court. If they don't pay you, you send them some interrogatories and find out if they've got any assets. So I say, you send me some judgment, credit, or interrogatories, and I'll take the Fifth Amendment. And then you file a motion to compel, and I'll go into court. I'll sit there and I'll take the Fifth Amendment, and if the judge says I can't take it, I'll say, well, Judge, you just ruled the Fifth Amendment applies in compelled testimony. If I'm compelled to answer the question, I take the Fifth Amendment. If I'm not compelled, goodbye. And I said, when the judge agrees with me and says this is compelled testimony and that I don't have to testify, then I'm going to have everything I need in this case to prove to Americans that the courts have taken the position that filing tax returns is not compelled testimony, and that was about 3 years ago, and I haven't heard a word from them since. However, I did write a book called Why Nobody's Required to File Returns, and there was a guy about 200 years ago named Thomas Paine who wrote a book called Common Sense. And Thomas Paine sold 140,000 of those books in a population of about 3 million people, and he caused the American Revolution. There's now over 1,000 copies of my book being downloaded for free each month on the internet. The internet is going to knock the IRS out of the water, because the major media can no longer control it. Could we get the major media to say stuff about us before? No, except for calling us kooks. Can we do something about it now? You know, when Joe Bannister, who you're going to hear from tomorrow, when Joe Bannister left the IRS, I was getting all kinds of questions on the internet about this guy. I mean, it just went around the country like wildfire. When I was in college, there was a guy named Marshall McLuhan that maybe some of you have heard about, who spoke about the global village. What we're getting into here is a global village. I had an ex-client of mine write me an email from South Africa who had downloaded my book. Anybody in the entire world can instantly get to my information and find out what a scam the federal tax system is. So all you've got to do is remember the word anti, A-N-T-I, -IRS. By the way, I'm a special agent for the anti-IRS. All you have to do is remember that word, anti-IRS, which is sort of like matter and antimatter. You know, the two cancel each other out. So if we get enough on the anti-IRS side, we're going to snuff out the IRS. So what I want to do, what I want to see, is I want to see 30 million people download my book by the end of next year, And we will have the 100th monkey syndrome. Anybody heard of that? You get enough monkeys picking the bananas, before long all of them like bananas. Okay? So what's going to happen is that we're going to make this change just by getting the information out to the American public. That's the first thing we have to do. The second thing we have to do is take away the fear. Okay? Now, how are we going to take away the fear? We got 75% of the people out there that are looking for a refund, and 25% of the people that are figuring out how to survive. The 75% of the people that are looking for a refund, the only way they can survive is because they have credit cards. And there's one other way that probably most of you haven't thought about. The only reason that the income tax, I figured this one out, can survive in this country and take so much of the wealth away from the working people is because they've managed to keep the products like the clothing and the electronics equipment cheap. Now, how do they do that? They send it out of the country. They have little children working child labor in China and different places like that and making us a shirt for $5, putting people out of work in this country so that we can afford to buy the shirt, right? Because they're taking half of our money. If they were leaving us our money, we could afford to pay enough to have workers in this country and employ more people. No. And then what are they doing with that money? They're sending it back out of the country again with whatever they do with it. But the point is, the middle class is getting shafted. The middle class is paying the taxes. And the middle class is sitting around here waiving their rights and doing all this voluntarily. So the income tax is only functioning because of all these other things like credit and like cheap child labor in other countries, which is taking labor away from here. So many big companies have moved out of the country. And if you'll notice, so many products are made in places like Taiwan. And, you know, the whole thing's a very complicated mess. And I don't want to get into all that today, but just think about it for a minute, about why, you know, they haven't had a rebellion in this country. And then another interesting thing is, how many of these people, you know, if we did have to pay all these prices that we should have to pay if everybody if the stuff was being made in our country, then the people wouldn't have enough to live on, you know. And then they might rebel against the income tax. Okay, now let's get on here with what I did with my Fifth Amendment thing. I said, now how am I going to get some publicity about this? So I put out a $50,000 reward for anybody that could show me two things. Number one, how to file a tax return without waiving my Fifth Amendment rights, and number two, what statute makes me liable to pay income taxes. There is no statute that makes anybody liable to pay the income tax. Although, unfortunately, the IRS can assess you under Section 6020B and then proceed to beat you up, okay? Which is something that a lot of people don't know, but that's something we have to deal with because it is the truth. In terms of the Fifth Amendment issue, I had various people apply for my reward, and one that applied for my reward was a famous attorney that probably everybody in California knows about by the name of Melvin Belli. How many people have heard of him? Okay. I think he died recently. But anyway, here's what Melvin said. He said, Mr. Conklin, please write me a check for $50,000. He said for the first part of your reward, what statute makes you liable? Section 6012 makes you liable. Well, he was wrong on that because that only applies to people that are already liable. But so I dismissed that one easily enough. But the Fifth Amendment one was more interesting. Melvin said, here's the way you file a tax return without waiving your Fifth Amendment rights. He said, you go to an attorney, and you give that attorney power of attorney to file the tax return for you. Okay? Well, right so far. And then what you do is the attorney will have a code number, and he'll take the money that you're going to send the IRS. Of course, this could only work in a self-employed type situation, but you give the money to the attorney, and he would pay it out of his trust fund. Okay? By the way, if somebody in here wants to fight the IRS, Melvin Belli's way would be a good way to do it, but you'd still waive your Fifth Amendment rights eventually, and I'm going to explain why. But this, I've thought up a whole bunch of ways you can fight the IRS and not take a lot of risk if you don't want to lose assets, and this is one way you could do it. So what you do is you have the attorney pay the IRS with a check out of his trust fund and file a tax return with a number on it instead of a name. Of course, the attorney signed the tax return as the power of attorney for this number that only he knows and that only you know. Now look at this long song and dance Melvin Belli is putting this thing through in order to protect the person's Fifth Amendment rights. What is he doing? He's admitting there's a Fifth Amendment problem, isn't he? Okay. So anyway, so then the attorney sends the tax return in, and of course, what does the IRS do when they get it? They call the attorney up and they say, who is this? And the attorney says, attorney-client privilege. Okay? Great. The guy's Fifth Amendment rights are protected, but the IRS can't credit the money. They don't know what to do with it. So they, I don't know, who knows, probably they just, spend it on dinners out or something. But anyway, a few years down the road, the guy gets a letter from the IRS, CID, let's say, and the criminal investigation is knocking on this guy's door, and they're going to prosecute him for willful failure to file. And this would be a sting operation. I've wanted for years, I've wanted some rich guy to do this approach. Some guy who's got a lot of money, who could just get up there and bait the IRS, and get them to come after him, and then we have a criminal trial, and the attorney gets up and he says, oh yeah, that guy filed and paid, and here's proof of it. Oh, he'd win the criminal case. We'd get a deal on the front page that some big rich guy just won a willful failure case, and we get a lot of publicity. And a guy could do that completely safely. But here's the problem. When the attorney got up there, he would waive the guy's Fifth Amendment rights. So I explained to Melvin, I said, this is great, you're right, except number one, you admit what I'm saying is true by this song and dance you've just created. And number two, the minute the attorney gets up there and explains to the IRS that you're the one that filed the return, he has waived your Fifth Amendment rights, and it's only at that point that the IRS can count that return as having been filed. So Melvin, I'm sorry, but you don't get the money. So then I put out a news release in the San Francisco Examiner, or whatever the newspaper is up there, that said, Belli backs down, because I knew that the guy probably would like to sue me, but he never did. So I missed that opportunity. What can you guys personally do about the problem? Okay, we've got several problems here in regards to getting everybody involved. Okay? There's an awful lot of people that have gotten themselves in over their heads. I don't know if any of those are here now, but if they are and they want my help, they can give me a call. Check my website out, look my material over, and give me a call. I specialize in helping people swim who are sinking. But let's talk about a way that everybody could get involved in this. Now, one way that I just said was a guy who had enough money, who was self-employed, could use the approach I just said. He would be in good shape because he would be able to prove, if the IRS should go after him, that he had filed and paid. And what's really interesting about that is the IRS could expend a couple of $1 million on a criminal case and then lose it. And they would lose it so fast. Can you imagine? Just think, I've worked personally on over 20 federal criminal cases and sat for hundreds and hundreds of hours in courtrooms on federal criminal cases. And I can just imagine the government going through their whole thing, and then the guy's defense comes, and all he does is put up the attorney that says the guy paid and filed, and here's a copy of his tax returns, and here's how it was done. Now, can you just imagine the special agent, how foolish he would feel, and how stupid the United States attorney would look, and how mad the judge would be that the IRS was wasting his time? Now, what would happen just with that one thing if we got 100 people that had high profile in the state of California to use that approach and baited the IRS to go after them criminally? We'd fill up the IRS's criminal investigation department with a bunch of people they couldn't win on, and the IRS wouldn't know it until after they'd presented their case and the defendant got up. Isn't that cool? Anybody ever see the movie The Sting? That would put that one issue, if you had 100 people in the state of California alone to do that, and 100 people, one criminal cases against the IRS, we'd have to bait the IRS to get it doing. First of all, the guys who were really cheating would get away with it because the IRS would be with those 100. And second of all, the IRS would have this huge, massive loss of all these cases, and they would expend millions of dollars. Nobody would get hurt. So do you see, all we got to do is get organized and think smart. There's some ways we could bring the tax system down in 6 months. Well, another way is this. Basically, everybody in the country can just quit filing. You just write a letter, you just write a letter April 15th that says you want an indefinite extension of time to file your tax returns until the IRS can show you how to file the tax return without waiving your Fifth Amendment rights, and you attach an attorney opinion letter, CPA. There's plenty of people writing them now. And if you're an employee, do me a favor. Do not file an exempt W-4. The biggest mistake that's been made, in my opinion, in the history of the freedom movement is the exempt W-4 issue. It puts you on the defensive. You've got to be on the offensive. The purpose of this fight is to end the federal income tax. The purpose of this fight is not to put yourself in a position you cannot defend. Unfortunately, many of the organizations around the country that are promoting this stuff, and the internet's full of it, are telling people to do things that don't work. They're using arguments that were defeated in court in 1980. The zero tax return approach used by some of the gurus around has been losing since 1982. Some of the cases quoted by these gurus that are promoting that stuff were even overturned. It's amazing to me. The only way that kind of an approach is going to work is if we get enough people to do it. I mean, if there's enough cockroaches running around, the IRS can try stomping on all of them, but they can't stomp all of them out. Okay? So what we have to do is learn to fight smart. So everybody has to look at his own individual situation and say, am I comfortable with this? It is possible to fight the IRS and be comfortable. Okay? I don't care what you do something. I mean, if the only thing you do is download my book from the internet and pass it out to 10 people, you've done something. Okay? Do what you're comfortable with. If you're a hardcore non-filer, non-payer, fine, but just be sure that you can, you know what you're doing and you can protect yourself if they come after you. There are a lot of people who don't file and don't pay in this country who have successfully challenged the IRS on those issues in terms of the IRS just giving up on them. But there's also a lot of other people, and many more people probably, who've been pounded into the ground. And there's a lot of people that get away with stuff because the IRS doesn't have time to get them. For example, some of the gurus that go around saying these things, like, they'll say, well, yeah, I filed a zero tax return for 4 years in a row, and I got 4 years of refunds. Well, they think that means that they were successful, that's something successful, that the IRS wouldn't give them that refund unless the IRS agreed with their argument. Well, that's not true. What are some other reasons the IRS might give a refund? The IRS might give a refund, and I've seen this happen, because they're deliberately setting up a criminal case. And what they do, for example, these gurus usually have some particular form letter that goes in with the tax return. The IRS isn't stupid. I mean, these guys have figured out how to make the American public bend down to them now for about 80 years. They're not dumb in that. So basically what they would do is they would send out they would give the people a refund 3-4 years in a row. And then what you'll see an indictment for perjury, for tax evasion. The guys who are helping those people may get indicted for aiding and abetting. The government has to be planning those sorts of things right now in order to knock the freedom movement on the ground. One of the things that I've often wondered is some of the people that are giving out some of this bad advice, I've often wondered if it's not the IRS themselves creating new business for themselves. And then another thing is, some people ask, well, why does the IRS allow this stuff to go on if it doesn't work? Well, it's in the IRS's best interest to allow it to go on. Because the IRS can go to Congress and they can say, look, see all these people out here that are cheating us? We had 10,000 people in the state of California file these zero tax returns last year, and they cheated us. We gave them their money back. We need more money to go after them. So Congress then relaxes the law and gives the government more money. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons. So when somebody says, oh, I did this, for example, they show me a document about a pure trust. And it says it's some letter written to somebody that says this pure trust is exempt from the filing of returns. Well, first of all, there's several problems. It may be a fake letter. It's very easy to prepare fake letters with word process machines and scanners. Anybody could take an IRS letter, scan it into a computer, even with the same signature on it, change what it said, and pass it out to the public and say, hey, look at this. I have seen letters like that I am convinced beyond a doubt are a scam. So the problem we've got in this movement is that we have a lot of opportunists doing that sort of thing. So I guess the message to you is there is a way to fight. There is a way to be productive. There is a way to make this change, but be very careful because there's also a lot of information that's not going to work and that's going to make it more difficult for you than it needs to be. Another thing that you have to realize is that the IRS is not responsible for anything they say or do in terms of this advice. For example, you could make an application for an exempt organization to the IRS. You could actually have a letter written directly to you stating that that organization was exempt, and then later the IRS could retroactively pull the exempt status, and their excuse would be, well, you weren't doing what you said you were doing. So when you see a pure trust salesman who has some anonymous letter to somebody else that says this thing doesn't have to pay tax, that actually, even if it were written to you, could be retroactively taken away, and you could be treated as if it were. But by the way, pure trusts are not non-taxable just because they happen to be pure trusts. Whatever a pure trust is, I've never quite figured out. I guess it's one that's been scrubbed well enough or something. But that's an unfortunate kind of thing that we have going on. Let's look at a system then that's safer. If you can't do an exempt W-4 and you're an employee, and you know, if you want to do an exempt W-4, that's up to you. However, if you get away with it, it's not because the law's on your side. It's because that there's so many people doing things, the IRS just doesn't have time to get them all. And that may be a reason to do it for some people. But people that are more cautious than that, everybody needs to do something. Remember that. If a guy who's an employee chooses not to file a tax return, he needs to set it up by getting an attorney opinion letter. He needs to set it up by letting the IRS know that he's concerned about his Fifth Amendment rights, and he sends that in requesting the extension of time. Now, what will the government do? Well, let's say the government got a couple million of those. Since there's no statute that makes you liable to pay income taxes, if your employer sends in your money, you know, there's been no assessment on you personally, it's going to show as like a credit to you, okay? And so the IRS can't really turn this into an actual income tax until you file the tax return, or until they file one for you. So then the IRS has to file a return for you under Section 6. You know, some of you have received these letters. The IRS files a tax return for you, and they start sending you letters, and eventually you'll get a 30-day letter, and then you'll get a 90-day letter, and the 90-day letter says that you have 90 days to petition the United States Tax Court. Well, there's been many crazy ideas about what you should do with 90-day letters over the years, one of which is don't file a tax court petition because it will give the tax court jurisdiction. Well, if you don't file the tax court petition, the IRS will then have jurisdiction to proceed to collect the assessment against you, no matter what a lot of these gurus say. So, if you ignore a statutory notice of deficiency, you've just eliminated an option. However, let's say you're an employee who is not really interested in jumping into this battle at a real deep level, that you don't want to lose your salary, you don't want to lose your car and your house, but you want to make some change. So you request the extension of time. The IRS is going to have to assess you. When they assess you, you'll get a statutory notice of deficiency. Now, many times I have seen the IRS ignore the fact that there's withholding. And if they don't do that, they'll give you some other bogus thing. Because since the burden of proof is on us, the IRS is so arrogant, they just make up a bunch of garbage. They just make it up. You know, and I could talk for hours about the kind of stuff they make up. But the great thing about it is, because they're so arrogant, and because they make up so much garbage on these statutory notices of deficiency, you've got a guaranteed win when you go in there. So what you do is you just file a normal tax court petition that argues normal things. You go in and you talk to the appeals officer, and the appeals officer will agree that there was X amount of deficiency, that there was Y amount of payment, and that there's Z amount of overpayment, for example. So now you've got an overpayment, so the tax court judge will make a decision that there's been an overpayment. Now, I have repeatedly heard appeals officers say at this point that, well, they don't care if you file returns or not. All they want you to do is sign the stipulation. So you'll be signing the stipulation. You won't be filing any returns. You sign a stipulation that says that there's been an overpayment, let's say, of X amount of dollars. That's your refund you would have gotten had you filed the tax return. Well, then what you do, the tax court doesn't have jurisdiction to order that there should be a refund of that money. All the tax court has jurisdiction to do is to say there's been an overpayment. So if you get this overpayment statement from the judge, which you will if there's been an overpayment, you've just made the IRS spend an incredible amount of time, effort, and money. As a matter of fact, I don't know how much it costs them, but I would say just to go to that point costs the IRS more money than they would collect from the average middle-class person. So now people say, well, what's the point in using that approach? I say, well, there's 2 points. The first point is people who were before afraid to get involved in this now have a way they can get involved. Number one. And number two, you're making the government spend all the money they collect on collecting the money. How long will that tax system work? Okay? So there is a point. There is a point to it. But people who are in this movement for only one reason, which many people are, they just want to get more money on their paycheck, unfortunately, it's not that easy. If it were that easy, there'd be more people in this room. Okay? It's not that easy. You cannot defeat the entire federal government, 80 years worth of taxation, with the information in a $35 book. Remember that. Yeah. You cannot defeat the entire federal tax system with the information in a $35 book. You can't take a few form letters that some guru has stolen from some other guru who already went to jail and put it in a $35 book, you know, and they write a book called Wolf in Sheep's Clothing or something. And I guess that's the next guru will be selling a book called Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. And, you know, that'll be $45 and guaranteed to get you out of your income tax if you just write these letters. That's not the way it works, but unfortunately, that's what is going on to a large extent. And it's not going to make the change. I don't know. You know, if enough people do it, of course it could make a change, but if enough people do it, if enough people don't do it, a lot of people will get hurt and other people will hear, oh, well, that doesn't work. Our Joe Blow got his house taken away and all this stuff happened. And you know, it'll just continue like this. Whenever you've got something, everybody hates the income tax. Even the guys that are getting refunds don't like it much, but they just, you know, they just want to stay out of it. But everybody hates it. So they can find, the people that are out there selling different ideas can find, you know, people that will pay to end this income tax quickly. There are no silver bullets. There is nothing magic. I've been in the movement 25 years. I can't give you anything magic. Okay, but let's go back to what I was just talking about. The guy gets the decision from the tax court judge that there's been an overpayment. So now he writes a letter to the arrogant IRS and says, a tax court judge just ruled there's been an overpayment on my account for that year. Please give it to me. Now the guy still hasn't filed a tax return. Well, the arrogant IRS will ignore him. So then he files a lawsuit in federal district court and attaches the tax court judge's opinion to it. He'll get that money. They won't argue about that because it's already collateral estoppel. He's got a tax court decision giving it to him, but he doesn't have the jurisdiction to ask tax court to order it to be given to him. So he goes to district court. So now the IRS has had to go through all these Mickey Mouse assessment procedures. They've had to deal with the guy in tax court, and then they have to fight a district court lawsuit. Now, once the guy does all this, the IRS will classify him as a tax protester, which they're not supposed to do anymore. Now they can call you a non-filer. Okay? But what you can do now is you can ask the IRS to send you your Freedom of Information file, and they won't give it all to you for 2 reasons. Number one, now that you're a bad boy and you're hassling them, they're going to withhold something. And the second reason is the IRS is so overburdened with this they can't comply in the required 30 days anyway. So once you do a Freedom of Information lawsuit, it's a Freedom of Information Act request, it's an automatic lawsuit that you've got prepared. So now the average guy who wanted to change the system could file 3 lawsuits instead of a tax return and make the government spend 5 times or 10 times as much as they would collect from him in taxes, and the guy has taken no risk. Now, on the one end, you have that kind of an approach, and I can think up many ideas you guys could use if you wanted to fight this system and not take risk. Now, the guys that don't care how much risk they take, or that think that the information in a $35 book is all they need, those guys, that's fine. Let them go out there and do it. But those of you that want to be a little more thoughtful about it, and that want to do, okay, something that's not so risky, think about some of these things that I'm saying, because that's certainly something you can do. Another thing, I want to make a couple more comments here. The kind of stuff that I see, the level of incompetence, unfortunately, is giving the IRS a lot of power. One of the places where there's a lot of incompetent information is on the issuance of an IRS summons and how to deal with it. There are still people out there that will go argue at an IRS summons that the IRS doesn't have delegation of authority to issue a summons. This stuff's still going on. I lost that argument over 12 years ago in court. I mean, it's not worth arguing. Okay? There's only two things you can do to an IRS summons. One thing is you can show up and take the Fifth Amendment, and two is you can show up and give the government the money, the information. Those are the only two choices you got, or you're going to go to jail for contempt if they should choose to enforce that summons. But there are still people that write letters and ignore summonses. There's still people that argue all kinds of arguments. They pay lots of people money. I worked on a case recently in Denver where some group down in Florida sent an attorney up to Denver to argue to the IRS that they didn't have jurisdiction to issue the summons, and they didn't have delegation of authority and all this stuff. And so the guy's marching off on his way to jail after he's paid thousands of dollars to get some attorney. I don't know where that guy went to law school, but he somehow got certified to do this stuff. So, see the problem? We've got to get better at what we're doing. We've got to make the IRS back down. And I'll tell you right now, in the state of Colorado, if some guy goes to a summons and handles the Fifth Amendment properly, they never do an enforcement order on it. Because the judges out there know the law. So please, think carefully about what you do. Don't take risks that you do not need to take. Understand what it is you're doing. Please keep the fight going, but don't be a needless victim. It's very important that you do that. Is my time up? A minute? Okay. As the IRS agent slowly came out of the anesthetic after surgery, he said, "Why are all the blinds drawn, doctor?" "There's a big fire across the street," the doctor replied. "We didn't want you to think the operation was a failure." Thank you.